আজকে সবাইকে স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি নীতি প্রণয়নের রাজনীতি এর 13তম সেশন চুক্তি ও উন্নয়ন which is deals and development এ। আমি ফাতেমা, আমি হেড অফ পলিসি অ্যাডভোকেসি হিসেবে ডিলস অ্যান্ড ডেভেলপমেন্ট সেশনটিতে বক্তা হিসেবে থাকছেন অধ্যাপক ডক্টর কুনাল সেন। ডক্টর সেনের একাডেমিক এবং ফলিত উন্নয়ন অর্থনৈতিক গবেষণায় 3 দশকেরও বেশি অভিজ্ঞতা রয়েছে। তিনি 2019 সাল থেকে ইউনিভার্সিটি অফ ম্যানচেস্টারের গ্লোবাল ডেভেলপমেন্ট ইনস্টিটিউটের ডেভেলপমেন্ট ইকোনমিক্স বিভাগে অধ্যাপনা হতে ছুটিতে আছেন এবং বর্তমানে জাতিসংঘ বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ের ওয়ার্ল্ড ইনস্টিটিউট অফ ডেভেলপমেন্ট ইকোনমিক রিসার্চের পরিচালক হিসেবে দায়িত্ব পালন করছেন। ডক্টর সেন 8টি বইয়ের লেখক এবং অর্থনৈতিক ও রাজনৈতিক অর্থনীতির উপরে 5টি খণ্ডের সম্পাদনা করেছেন। তার বইগুলির মধ্যে রয়েছে দ্য পলিটিক্যাল ইকোনমি অফ ইন্ডিয়াস গ্রোথ এপিসোডস, দ্য প্রসেস অফ ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল লিবারালাইজেশন ইন ইন্ডিয়া এবং দ্য ইকোনমিক রিস্ট্রাকচারিং ইন ইস্ট এশিয়া অ্যান্ড ইন্ডিয়া, দ্য পার্সপেক্টিভ অন পলিসি রিফর্ম। তিনি ডিলস অ্যান্ড ডেভেলপমেন্ট, দ্য পলিটিক্যাল ডাইনামিক্স অফ গ্রোথ এপিসোডস এবং দ্য পলিটিক্স অফ ইনক্লুসিভ ডেভেলপমেন্টের সহ সম্পাদক এবং তার ক্ষেত্রের বিষয়গুলোর উপর তার 90টিরও বেশি পিয়ার রিভিউ জার্নাল নিবন্ধন প্রকাশ করেছেন। সো স্যারের সম্পর্কে আসলে আর খুব বেশি ইন্ট্রোডাকশন দেওয়ার প্রয়োজন নেই। আই এম শিওর মানে স্যারকে অনেকেই চিনেন। সো আমি আসলে আর বেশি সময় না নিয়ে স্যারের কাছে চলে যেতে চাই আজকের এক্সাইটিং মডেলটার জন্য। আমরা সবাই খুব এক্সাইটেড আজকে স্যারের কাছ থেকে এই বিষয় শোনার জন্য। স্যার, ইফ আই মে হ্যান্ড ওভার টু ইউ।
ধন্যবাদ ফাতিমা, আপনার সবাইকে আমি স্বাগত জানাই। আর আমি শুরু করছি, আমি স্লাইড থেকে শেয়ার করে করবো। প্রথমে চেষ্টা করে দেখি এটা হচ্ছে না কিনা, কাজ করছে না কিনা। তো আমি যেটা উপরে বলবো আজকে ওটা হচ্ছে বইটার, আমি যে লেকচারটা হচ্ছে ডিলস এন্ড ডেভেলপমেন্ট পলিটিক্যাল ইকোনমি অফ গ্রোথ এপিসোডস। এটা বইয়ের উপরে, বইটা আমি কয়েক বছর আগে বেরিয়েছে, কিন্তু বইটা এখনো কোয়াইট রেলেভেন্ট অন ডিসকাসিং ইকোনমিক গ্রোথ ইন ডেভেলপিং কান্ট্রিজ, স্পেশালি ইনক্লুডিং বাংলাদেশ। তো বইটার নামটা হচ্ছে অ্যাজ দ্য লেকচারের নাম যেমন ডিলস এন্ড ডেভেলপমেন্ট পলিটিক্যাল ডাইনামিক্স অফ গ্রোথ এপিসোডস। এই বইটা আমি এডিট করেছি উইথ ল্যান্ড প্রিচেট আর এরিক ওয়ার্কার, অক্সফোর্ড ইউনিভার্সিটি প্রেস। এটা ওপেন অ্যাক্সেসে বেরিয়েছে, মানে যে কোনো কেউ এটা ডাউনলোড করতে পারে ফর ফ্রি। আর প্লিজ গো অ্যান্ড টেক এ লুক অ্যাট দ্য লিঙ্ক অ্যান্ড ইউ ক্যান ডাউনলোড ফর ফ্রি, অ্যান্ড দ্যাটস ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট। আমি চাই সবাই বইটা এটা পড়তে পারে। তো প্রথম প্রশ্নটা হচ্ছে যে হোয়াট ইজ গ্রোথ? আমরা তো অফকোর্স জানি গ্রোথ ইজ জিডিপি per capita change, that is the definition of economic growth, কিন্তু that's not enough really, because আসলে যেটা হয়েছে academic and policy literature the growth has been focusing on the long run growth of output per capita, মানে economic growth over several decades. সেটা কারণ আছে, because we need to understand যে কি হচ্ছে in a country over 20, 30, 40 years. এক বছর দু বছর দেখে তো কিছু লাভ নেই। So everybody wants to understand যে over 30, 40 years like Bangladesh, how much has Bangladesh grown? That is, there's a reason for looking at the long run growth of output per capita. কিন্তু যেটা প্রবলেমটা হচ্ছে যে লং রান গ্রোথ অ্যাভারেজেস এর যদি দেখা হয়, it absolutely misses the one important point, that it masks distinct periods of success and failure. যেটা দেখা যায়, যেটা আমি প্রথমে একটুখানি বলবো, যে countries grow very rapidly and then after a few years, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe even longer, they tend to often show growth declines. So average করলে you miss that important part of what economic growth is, that it is very volatile. And this is pretty much true for most developing countries. So what we tend to see are massive discrete changes in growth, and it's very common in developing countries, in some more than others, but it is very rare to see a developing country that's seen steady growth over several decades. And so what we really need to understand, the economic development and economic growth, it's about growth episodes. Countries grow very rapidly sometimes for some years, and then they often tend to show deceleration, so collapses. So focusing on growth really should be about growth episodes, episodic growth, rather than long-run growth. It is a very important point about our book, and very important for anyone to understand economic growth. The long-run growth, it doesn't really tell us very much about policies. And we need to understand growth in episodic sense. The key hoche from one decade to another decade, or even within decades, and to understand the countries tend to show rapid growth, and then often followed by growth declines, the growth stagnation. এটা একটা এক্সাম্পল জর্ডান থেকে নিয়েছি। আমাদের একটা হ্যান্ডবুক আছে, হ্যান্ডবুক ইকোনমিক গ্রোথ। এটা again it's online and free, available for downloading for free. It's a good example. Jordan is a country, it's the Middle East. You can see clearly the GDP per capita. This is in log terms. এটা ইনক্রিজ করছে, আবার কমছে, আবার ইনক্রিজ করছে, আবার কমছে, আবার ইনক্রিজ করছে। তো এখানে যখন এগুলো হচ্ছে, you can see the growth rates are changing massively. এই প্রথম এপিসোড এটা হয়েছিল ওটা 1965, growth rates were 6.3% per capita. কিন্তু তারপরে দেখা গেল যে গ্রোথ রেট ওয়াজ -4.2% per year. তার মানে 10.6 percentage points change in the growth rate. Huge. কিন্তু আবার from 1974, again growth started increasing and the growth rate was 7.9% per capita per year, and the change in growth was 12.1%. Huge. আবার তারপরে 1982 পরে আবার গ্রোথ ফল করে। আর গ্রোথ তখন became আবার নেগেটিভ হয়ে যায়, -4.7% per year, massive change in growth rates from the previous growth rate of 12.5%. And finally, till data we have more recently, we have positive growth rate, not as much as before, but again a positive growth rate for several years. তো এই যেটা দেখি এটা এরকম প্যাটার্ন যে গ্রোথ ইকোনমিক পার ক্যাপিটা ইনকাম বাড়ছে, আবার কমছে, আবার বাড়ছে, আবার কমছে, আবার বাড়ছে, এটা কিন্তু খুবই কমন। আর এটা আমরা অনেক সময় মিস করে যাই। এটা আমরা নর্মালি কি করবো, আমরা এটাকে অ্যাভারেজ করবো, এই পুরো পিরিয়ডটা 1950 to 2010 অ্যাভারেজ করবো, করলে আমরা বুঝতে পারবো না যে গ্রোথ অ্যাকচুয়ালি ভীষণ ভলাটাইল। তো এটা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট পয়েন্ট যে আমরা চেষ্টা করছি বলতে হবে আমাদের এই বলতে চাই এই লেকচারে। সো সিম্পল পয়েন্ট হচ্ছে the growth episodes matter. Most countries outside the old OECD have erratic growth performance. Actually OECD countryর মধ্যে এটা দেখা যায় না। OECD countryর মধ্যে অনেক স্টেবল গ্রোথ দেখা যায়, খুব কম হয় যে 7% গ্রোথ রেট, তারপরে নেক্সট ডেকেডে -3%, আবার 5%, এরকম দেখা যায় না। OECD country দেখা যায় growth is around 2%, 3%, maybe even 4% for many years, in fact decades. So এটা একটা ইন্টারেস্টিং অবজারভেশন যে কেন OECD countries, rich countries, the old OECD countries এরকম গ্রোথ দেখা যায় না, এরকম এরাটিক গ্রোথ দেখা যায় না। আর অবভিয়াসলি সিম্পল একটা পয়েন্ট যে যদি একটা দেশ যদি growth stagnation অ্যাভয়েড করতে পারে কিংবা growth collapse, that country will do very well. Can a growth always will be positive? So obviously the important question then is that then how can a country avoid growth stagnation and certainly collapse? Another important point we make in this book and in this lecture, this is not simply achieved by fixing institutions. অনেক একটা আর্গুমেন্ট আছে, এটা এসছে দুজন খুব নাম করা ইকোনমিক্স পলিটিক্যাল সায়েন্টিস্ট ডারার আচিমোগলু আর জেমস রবিনসন, ওরা আর্গুই করেছে যে ইনস্টিটিউশন ফিক্স করে দাও সবকিছু ঠিক হয়ে যাবে, মানে বেটার ইনস্টিটিউশন নিয়ে আসো। আর আমাদের আর্গুমেন্ট হচ্ছে দ্যাটস কমপ্লিটলি রং। ইনফ্যাক্ট দ্যাট ইজ নট দ্য প্রবলেম। ফিক্সিং ইনস্টিটিউশনস ইজ নট দ্য সলিউশন, and I'll explain what we mean by that in this lecture. So এটা খুব তাড়াতাড়ি করছে, এটা বেশি অনেক নাম্বারস আছে, কিন্তু পয়েন্ট হচ্ছে যে তুমি যদি দেখো যে one sees the growth performance across countries, there are some countries যেখানে স্টেডি গ্রোথ দেখা গেছে। আর এখানে আমি দেখতে পাচ্ছি টার্কি, ইউকে, গ্রেট ব্রিটেন, কলম্বিয়া। আবার কিছু দেশ আছে যেখানে সারাক্ষণ ধরে গ্রোথ কোল্যাপস করে যাচ্ছে, নেগেটিভ গ্রোথ হচ্ছে। And you can see in this categories of countries, this is an example of collapse, যেখানে growth rate is -2 over time and in over 5-year periods. Ekhane it's -2 to 0. So this is a negative growth. A negative growth, Haiti, Liberia, Somalia are the examples. Tarpore, there are countries, which is more common kind of situation. You see negative growth for some time and you see positive growth. So these are boom and bust countries. This is very common in developing countries, boom and bust countries. Kichu bochorer jonno positive growth, kichu bochorer negative growth. Finally, a very few set of countries. By the way, a group of 30 countries. When 1/4 of the sample of countries are countries which have boom and bust growth, which are the countries which I really want to talk about. Finally, very few countries, 8 out of 120 countries, growth rates are very, very high. 4 to 6% per year or over 6% per year. So rapid growth of boom. And you can see these countries, and we know which ones they are because they're very famous in the literature: Botswana, Korea, Taiwan. Kintu 8 out of 120 are in that category, very few. Okay, so jodi tai hoy je if growth is episodic and we see boom and bust growth, then don't institutions make a difference? Institutional quality improve korle ki better hobe? So improving rule of law, improving accountability, improving making political institutions stronger, economic institutions stronger. Would that not be the way to solve this problem? No. Why not? There's a very simple way to explain this. If you do a correlation between institutional quality, bureaucratic quality, corruption, law and order, democratic accountability, and you do a correlation with level of income, there is a very strong correlation of 0.4, 0.5, 0.4 or so. So in other words, that over time, as countries improve institutions, they become richer. But if you do a correlation of growth of GDP, which is the economic growth rate, on initial level institutions, the correlation is 0.09 or 0.06, nothing, almost zero. If you do a correlation of growth of GDP on changes in institutions, then you get even a lower correlation, again, almost close to zero, which means that there is no connection between growth and institutions, and even less of growth and changes in institutions over a 20-year period, because that's the period we have on where we have the data. That's a remarkable saddest fact. কারণ এতদিন ধরে ইকোনমি সবসময় বলে যায় ইনস্টিটিউশনাল কোয়ালিটি ইমপ্রুভ করলে ইকোনমিক ডেভেলপমেন্ট হবে, কিন্তু এখান থেকে বোঝা যাচ্ছে সিম্পল একটা কোরিলেশন থেকে বোঝা যাচ্ছে that's not at all obvious. So that's an important insight that we're going to try and say কেন এরকম যে institutions fix করে যে সলিউশনটা হবে এটা কেন হচ্ছে না, and that's where we need to move away from institutions to other aspects of economic growth, and that's what I'm going to try and talk about now. So let me skip this. So basically the point is that how do we explain then that countries go from stagnation or crisis to miracle growth or stable growth, so that we see growth accelerations? And how do we explain then that after maybe after a few years or maybe after a decade, we tend to see countries then move into stagnation or crisis or growth collapse? What explains this? Why do these countries accelerate in growth, and why sometimes in many cases countries show growth collapses? What kind of a theoretical framework can explain this? Because institutions cannot, because institutions by nature are fixed in time. They don't move very quickly. So clearly institutional quality cannot be the answer, because they are very, so for example, rule of law takes a long time to change it. Bureaucratic quality takes a long time to change it. And yet growth is very fast moving. Growth is extremely episodic. So we need to get out of the argument that institutions make a difference in explaining economic growth or economic development. So then what can explain this? And what kind of theoretical apparatus do we need to explain this? And this is where the framework I'm going to propose, called deals in development, come in. So here's what we need to understand. Understanding variations in growth requires understanding differences between countries of similarly bad institutions. We're talking about countries with bad institutions, bad in many respects, political institutions, economic institutions. Then what explains different kinds of growth? And here's the argument that deals, which we can say in Bengali, samjhota, not rules, dictate the terms of both investor decisions. So what are deals? In a deals world, investor terms and protections are selectively enforced. So not the neutral application of policies, but a firm's investor-specific arrangement. It's subject to change depending on regime, administration, and business-government relations. Let's take a very specific example. Imagine a political leader or a bureaucrat in a particular country wants to favor a particular investor. So there are 5 investors coming to looking for investment permits or construction permit, and this politician or bureaucrat says, okay, this person or this company will get it, not the others. That's a deal. Because a rule would have been, if you meet certain criteria, for example, if you have you have relevant assets, you have a good investment plan, then you should get the construction or investment permit. Then it doesn't really matter who should be given. Maybe everyone should be given, or maybe no one at all. But when you have a situation when politicians or bureaucrats favor one particular investor, and there is a very specific firm investor-specific arrangement, that's a deal. That's not a rule. And obviously, you can imagine data change korte pare. হয়তো একটা regime একটা particular set of investors কে favor করবে, আর একটা regime অন্য একটা set of investors কে favor করবে। আমরা করে যাকে অনেক সময় আমরা crony capitalism বলি, যেখানে politicians favor certain firms who they think they might be, for various reasons, they might be corrupt, they might be because these firms are linked to them in a family situation, whatever it is. There may be many reasons. But here the point is that the deal is a firm investor-specific arrangement, not the neutral application policies. And obviously, which business interests are present determines the overall demand on government to set policy, because sometimes the big investors want these deals, sometimes there may be some smaller investors. So what really shapes the way we see the state business or firm investor arrangement, this deal, depends on which interests are being represented in this arrangement. And we could argue that this kind of situation, these deals, leads to feedback loops that mediate to the political settlement, which I'll define in a minute, determines the dynamics of growth episodes. So deals and what we call ask are the king, are the primary determinants of economic growth, not institutions, not rules. Okay, so that's really a core argument. Now let's try to make it clear. So I'm going to take you through a couple of because I don't want to spend too much time on the graphs. One of the things is that, you know, you have to improve your rules, or often what they call doing business reforms. You have to improve policies on different rules and competition law, this and that, trade policy. And often this is the kind of advice we get to hear from the World Bank, for example. The rules are really important and you need to make rules much better, make them more business friendly. But if you look at the evidence on this, there's really no argument on this. There's no evidence. And here's where it's so interesting to look at the World Bank's doing business surveys, which look at the rules in the country, and the World Bank enterprise surveys, which asks firm, how long did it take to get a construction permit or investment permit? And we get two completely different answers. So in this particular diagram, we're just putting together both the enterprise surveys and the doing business surveys. And in one diagram, ki dekha jaচ্ছে je doing business rules vary across countries. You can see that at a normal distribution method. You can see that normal distribution method. সব মানে অনেক দেশে অনেক সময় লাগে, অনেক দেশে অনেক কম সময় লাগে according to the rules. কিন্তু কি অ্যাকচুয়ালি হচ্ছে যে বেশিরভাগ সময়, even the rules are saying it will take 30 days or take 20 days to get a construction permit, actually বেশিরভাগ সময়, or let me say 60 days, বেশিরভাগ সময় firms are getting their construction permit or investment permit within, like, say, 15 days. You can see this big jump, distribution here in this kind of area. Now, কেন এরকম হচ্ছে? কেন do we see deals and rules so far apart? There are many possible reasons. After the obvious reason, corruption. Firms find a way to get around the system. They are offering bribes to bureaucrats and politicians. It could also be that the bureaucrats and politicians are trying to make things easier for these firms because they think they are particularly this cohesive relationship between the firm and the bureaucrat. অনেক রকমের কারণ হতে পারে, কিন্তু পয়েন্টটা হচ্ছে যে আমরা যখন আমরা শুনি যে ওয়ার্ল্ড ব্যাংক ডুইং বিজনেস সার্ভিস থেকে একটা দেশকে ইমপ্রুভ করতে হবে রুলস, actually in reality that doesn't really seem to make any sense, because the reality is firms are getting the investment permits far less time than what's stated. That's a really important thing to consider. This particular graph. I'm now going to talk about the theory. The theory is very important. How can we explain this? And here we need two core variables and one intermediary variable. It is a bit complicated, and hopefully it should be clear as I speak and I explain these concepts. The first core variable is a political settlement. And this, of course, draws a lot from the work of Mushtaq Khan in particular, but others also in this area. And then the second core variable is rent space. I'll explain this in a minute. And the intermediate variable is what I said, the deal space, the deal between the business person and the politician or the bureaucrat. So two core variables, political settlement, rent space, and the intermediate variable, deal space. And the outcome variable, of course, is economic growth. So what we expect is that this interaction of these variables will then culminate in either rapid growth or growth collapse or stagnant growth. So this is the way we should think about it. So now let me explain each of these variables in turn. The political settlement, as I said, drawing from the work of Mushtaq Khan. So what is a political settlement? The balance of power between economic and political elites. Who has the power? How do they wield it? How stable is the balance of power? Then the political settlement interacts with the rent space to determine the nature of deals. And then we see that with the political settlement in a country and the rent space, we have deals being offered to different economic actors for various different reasons. And some of the deals are maybe growth enhancing, they are good for growth or investment, but some of them may not be growth enhancing, but those kind of deals are needed for the stability of the political settlement. Now, let me be clear. Let me give an example here on why I say that even though the deals are not growth enhancing, in other words, not conducive to investment and growth, they may be important still for the political settlement. So, for example, if you have a situation where the political elite are offering deals to powerful business people, giving them special favors, and these business people are very, very powerful in the country. If they don't get this kind of special favors, they're going to make trouble for the political elite. They might try and mobilize either the army or other actors to try and overthrow the regime. In that case, the political elite offers these deals to the business people because they want to keep them happy. They want to make sure that they don't create problems for the political elite. So this is important because while this kind of deal is not a good thing, because this business people may not be very productive, and often are not productive, these deals are important to keep the political settlement stable. Otherwise, there will be a chaos, there will be military coups, there will be many different implications for the political settlement. And that's an example where deal is not necessarily a good deal, bhalo deal na hota, kintu ota khub important for keeping the political settlement stable. And that's very important in our story. So as we following Mushtaq Khan's work, we can differentiate two kinds of political settlements. One is a dominant political settlement, where there's a concentration of power in one dominant political group of elites, so very strong versus weak. So we have a situation where one set of elites have very lot of power, and there are other elites who are power is dispersed and they're pretty weak. That's an example of a dominant political settlement. In Africa, Rwanda is a good example for dominant political settlement. Jekhane Kagame and RPF, the Rwanda Patriotic Front, have a huge amount of power. So it's a dominant political settlement. And there are many other examples of that in the developing world. On the other hand, competitive political settlements is where power is dispersed across several political elites, each jockeying for political control. The Bangladesh is given as an example of competitive clientelism by Mushtaq and others. One could argue whether it's true or not now, because things have changed a little bit, but it could well be or maybe not, and that's something we can discuss in the Q&A. Ghana is a good example of competitive settlements because in Ghana, there are two major political parties who are often, one party comes to power in one election, they lose the next election, the other party comes to power. So in other words, the kind of power sharing chale, it's a very peaceful transition, kind of problem because Ghana automatic democracy established, but it's an example of competitive political settlement. Now, countries do move from dominant to competitive to dominant. That often happens. You could even argue in India, we are moving from competitive to dominant political settlement. These things are changing over time for various reasons. Now, one point that has been made by many scholars, including Mushtaq also, but others too, that in dominant settlements, elites have long-time horizons because they know they're in power. They have the power to think about the future. So they have long-time horizons and they're capable to enforce institutions. And that's one thing about dominant settlements where elites have long-time horizons. It doesn't mean that they're using the long-time horizons productively. May not be. They might be using their dominance to loot the country, to indulge in high level of corruption. But it is also possible that when they have long-time horizons, they can behave like a developmental state. For example, what we saw in South Korea. For example, what we saw in Taiwan. These are examples where elites had long-term horizons because they are mostly autocratic countries, and therefore they could bring about a lot of things which helped in economic growth. In competitive settlements, elites have short-term time horizons and have to resort to clientelist distribution resources to buy political support because they are always never sure there are power ashbe naki na. After election or jitlo, por election or hallo. সেই জন্য ওখানে অনেক সময় খুব high levels of corruption হয় ওই কারণে। And normally, and India is another good example here in this case, because of the competitive nature of elections, political parties have to mobilize a lot of money to finance elections, finance their election campaigns. And that leads to also a lot of corruption. So that's a kind of differentiation between dominant settlements and competitive settlements. It's not a hard and fast rule, of course, যে সব dominant settlements ভালো হতে হবে আর সব competitive settlements খারাপ হতে হবে. That is not the case. Into there is a implication of the fact that in one settlement, there is a long time horizon for elites. In another settlement, there's a short time horizon for elites. And that's the important point. Okay, moving forward. The rent space. The rent space একটা 2x2 typology দেখা যেতে পারে. Let's look at the typology. Let's think about a high rent sector. যেখানে অনেক rent আছে. মানে অনেক তোমার মানে rentটা এখানে বলতে চাই not in a bad sense that because of the fact that the prices that are being charged are much higher than costs of production. Let me put it in that simple way. In the high rent segment of the rent space, there are two kinds of firms. One are export-oriented firms. We call them rentiers. These are mostly mining companies, iron ore, gold and diamond miners, tree cropping, tax concession, forestry. And then there are domestic market-oriented firms, power brokers. We call them power brokers. These are legislative monopolies of oligopolies like petroleum distribution, natural monopolies, oligopolies like telecommunications. So power brokers are firms or companies which are in the high rent sectors because monopolies by nature is high rent. You're obviously earning much more than what your cost of production is, but they're geared towards domestic market. Well, rentiers are high rent also, but they're geared towards the export market. Now let's look at the other side of the rent space. These are competitive sectors. And in this, there are two kinds of firms also. They're magicians. These are agro-processing firms, cocoa, garments in Bangladesh, ready-made garments in Bangladesh, auto industry in India, so on and so forth. JKNA firms are outward-oriented, but they're facing global markets. They have to be competitive. Otherwise, they cannot survive. And then finally, in the bottom right side of the rent space, there are workhorses. These are traders, retailers, subsistence farmers, informal manufacturing, who are also in competitive sectors, but are geared towards the domestic market. So a lot of the informal sector, as we call this informal sector, are workhorses. Small little companies or even household enterprises who are just about surviving in competitive markets, but are geared towards domestic production. So this 2x2, high rent, export-oriented rentiers, high rent domestic market, power brokers, competitive export-oriented magicians, and competitive domestic market workhorses. So that's the way of the rent space. So now let's think about this. Okay, so how does this matter? How does the rent space play a role in explaining economic growth? Well, each of these companies, each of these firms have different asks of the state. They're asking different things of the government. Let's take an example. Let's take the rentiers. What do the rentiers want? Rentiers want a low tax regime. They don't want to pay taxes because they're export-oriented and they want to maximize profits and they don't want to pay taxes. They want reduced red tape. They want non-intervention. And what do they want from the state capabilities? They want good infrastructure. They need ports. They need good infrastructure, railways, power. But they also want the state to not to regulate them because they want to extract the profits from that particular segment, mining and so on. They don't want states to have high capability for regulation. They want low capability. So it's a very important point here. They want good infrastructure, yes, but they want low capability of the state to regulate, negotiate, and enforce rules. Power brokers, similar. Policies that they want barriers to entry. If you're a monopoly firm, like suppose you're a telecommunication company in Bangladesh, and you're the only company, you don't want other telecommunication companies. You want to put up barriers to them, to entry. So you want barriers to entry, you want high tariffs, you want market distortions, and you also don't want strong states. A strong state might say, sorry, I cannot allow one telecommunication company in this country. I need to have 2 or 3 or more or 4. So you want a state that is not able to bring about market competition. So we want weak institutions, lack of transparency, no bureaucratic autonomy, order without rule of law. So that's what you want. You want a weak state. On the other hand, on the other side, magicians, they also want low taxes, reduced red tape because they need to export, but they are looking for a state that has some capability. They want a state that is providing market-friendly interventions, special economic zones, market-friendly trade policy, and so on. So they have a different ask for the state. They want a state that is reasonably capable. Otherwise, they cannot be competitive in the international market. Similarly, workhorses also want low taxes and so on, but they also need some capability to provide things like roads, power, and so on. So the point here is that in the rent space, different firms are asking different things on the state. Renters and power brokers are saying, we don't want you around. to kind of do anything to us. Don't get in our way. And therefore, their interest is to keep a state as a weak state. Magicians and workhorses need certain levels of state capability. Otherwise, they cannot survive. So they want to have a reasonably competent, if not a high capability state, a reasonably competent state. So this is important because it tells us a little bit about how the rent space and where firms are located has an effect on institutions and also the nature of what happens in terms of state capability. This is the link between economics and politics that we're making in this particular lecture, which is very important. Okay, so now the final thing, the deal space. Deal space is 2 by 2, a 2 by 2 matrix. Again, let's think about open deals. Open deals are deals that je kono keu pete pare. My favorite example is a very nice paper that came out in a very good economics journal. যেখানে দেখা গেছিল যে to get a driver's license in Delhi, you don't have to pass a driving test. What you do is you go to a broker who then pays a bribe to the inspector, and you pay the money to the broker then bribes the inspector, and there you go, you get your license. But anybody can do that. Anyone is allowed to go and pay the broker and get the license. So you have a lot of people who are driving around in Delhi in car without proper driving license and proper driving knowledge. That's a retail corruption. It's open deal, it's ordered. You have the money, you pay the broker, you get the deal, you get your license by passing a driving test or any kind of driving instructions. On the other side, let's take open disordered. Open disordered is a situation that anybody can get a deal, but you're not sure whether the deal will be honored or not. So in informal sector, ki hoy onek shomoy je small little firms go to brokers and say, can I get some kind of help in this way for the politician? And often what happens, the politician might promise something, but cannot deliver it. This is very typical in many informal sector in many countries. So this is a situation of open deals, but are disordered. In other words, unpredictable deals. Deals have uncertain time horizon. And then the other side, we have closed deals, which are only available to certain kinds of individuals. And these are often given based on identities. In other words, the deal is given to somebody because there's something about that individual or the company that is favored by the politician or bureaucrat. And generally, we can call those closed ordered deals as crony capitalism. So Indonesia under Suharto, Russia under Putin, China, Korea, and so on. These are ordered because once you get this deal, if you're a company in Indonesia from the Suharto regime, you get this deal, you know that will be honored. So you're pretty assured that the deal will stay done and it's predictable. But it's only being offered to some companies, not all. And that's essentially a closed order deal. And finally, closed disorder is fragile states. Deals are not available to everybody, but when they're offered, because of the fragility of the state, then of course the deals are disordered. You can think of Somalia, you can think of South Sudan, you can think of Afghanistan, you can think of many other countries in the fragile context. So these are closed disordered deals. Now, why is this important for growth investment? If I'm an investor, what do I want? I want ordered deals. That's very clear. I don't want disordered deals because I don't know whether I should invest or not. Now, if I want an ordered deal, do I want a closed ordered deal or do I want an open ordered deal? And that's when the rent space comes in. So for some companies, they want an open ordered deal because they feel like there is no benefit from being a closed ordered deal. So you can imagine garment companies, perhaps in Bangladesh could be an example, though I'm not completely sure that's true or not. But even so suppose it's true that any garment RMG company wants to get a certain license from the government, then basically it's an open order deal. But of course, some companies don't want open order deals because they want that deal for themselves, nobody else. They want to shut out competition. And this is what we see in crony capitalism. There's a deliberate attempt to not offer the deal to everyone else, and these are ordered closed deals. Both are good for growth, closed and open, at least in the sense of we have an ordered deal, you can then invest. But of course, these have different implications for state capabilities. And that's exactly what we're going to try and talk about, that even though both ordered, open, ordered, closed deals are good for growth and investment, they have different implications for state capabilities, and therefore for the way growth episodes happen. Disordered deals, nobody would want really. no investor will want a disordered deal. They want to be sure that when they ask for a deal, this deal is honored. So disordered deals happens in contexts where there's fragility, where there is, as I said, informal sectors who don't have much power. So this is not exactly a situation that you want to have when you want to have economic growth. Okay, now let me move on. I hope it's all clear so far and we can come back to this. So here's the way to think about this. The political settlement explains the balance of power between elites. Rent space explains what companies are asking for. And the nature of the rent space tells us which kind of companies are important, which kind of firms are important in a particular country. For example, if you're a country like Angola, if you're a country like Nigeria, you have a lot of power in the rentier space. A lot of multinationals operating as oil companies, for example. On the other hand, if you're a Thailand, or if you're a Malaysia, or if you are a Cambodia, you have probably more presence of magicians in the rent space. In other words, companies which are exporting in competitive sectors. So we seem to see around the world, in the developing world, some countries where there's more of rentiers and maybe even power brokers, and some countries where you see more magicians and perhaps even workhorses. I would say in Bangladesh, perhaps it's sort of 50-50. You have quite a few companies which are in the power broker rentier space, well, power broker space, not rentier because Bangladesh doesn't have a natural resource exporting sector as much. But also we have ready-made garments and other companies in the magician and worker space. So Bangladesh is somewhere in the middle, but there are examples of countries that are more in one direction than the other. Then that determines the deal space. What kind of deals are offered to whom? And then, as I said, depending on the deals, we see economic growth and social transformation. But that's not the end of the framework. What happens there then explains the feedback loop that happens that goes back into the rent space and the political settlement. So this is very important to us because this is telling us that why there is positive growth for some time, and then over time, we start seeing negative growth. Because the growth episode itself shapes, fashions the nature of the rent space and the political settlement, which then again has influence on the deal space and again on economic growth. So it's a circular process going on all the time in countries over time. That's very important. There is a feedback loop happening from the growth episode itself back to the rent space, back to the political settlement. Okay, so then basically in the framework, we can ask the two questions. How can we explain positive growth? Why do we see economic growth happening sometimes very rapidly? And then why do we see growth finishing? Why does growth stop? So on the first question, why do we see rapid growth? We make an argument that political settlement that we see in the country shifts from disordered to ordered deals, including close ordered deals. And when we see that, then we see rapid growth. Why does growth stop? Often in these countries, close order deals become very important, and close order deals tend to end badly, either because it don't allow for total transformation, because they offer to only a few firms, or because suddenly there's a pushback against those deals. Let me give an example again from India, because I have this book that was mentioned, Fatima, earlier. So in India, what happened in the 2000s under the regime, which was led by the Congress Party, what was happening was there was very rapid growth. But then over time, there were close order deals being offered to telecommunication companies, mining companies, and then increasingly there was a sense there was a lot of corruption. So for those famous 3G scandal in telecommunications, there was many scandals in the mining. And then what happened was that many civil society actors, citizens started mobilizing against the state, saying this is something we don't like. And as these things became more and more important in the media of corruption, there were, of course, elections were held, and then at that point, the party in power lost the elections. So there was political delegitimation. So that's why we can explain India had this very, very rapid growth in the 2000s. And as I argue in my book, after that, because these deals were mostly close-ordered deals offered to power brokers and rentiers, there was a problem of political delegitimation leading to a pushback from civil society and others in the media, leading to corruption scandals, leading to economic growth collapse. Growth went down substantially. Not as a negative growth, but growth went substantially down after 2010 or so. So that's a kind of example that we have from India. Okay, so I'm going to skip. This is very complicated. Let me just want to skip this particular part. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about, how we do. So this framework we put together, it can be applied to any country, really. And we can think about countries which have different types of political settlement, where they are located in the dual continuum and the nature of growth outcomes. So we can apply to many different, and we applied it to several countries in Africa and Asia. And I'm going to get through all the country case studies, where we try to have countries in dominant political settlements and competitive political settlements. Dominant being Cambodia, Liberia, Uganda, Rwanda, and competitive being Bangladesh, at least at that time, Ghana, Liberia, Malawi. And then on the terms of institutions and rules, some countries had totally personalized institutions, mostly deal-based economies, in the considered countries here. And then some countries which had a little bit more rules based, not completely, because none of them are rules-based economies, a little bit more rules than deals. Malaysia and India, Thailand were examples here. So we chose countries in this kind of selection criteria, trying to understand difference across political settlements and difference across deals and rules. So again, very, very quickly, I'm going to talk about the firm because I'm a little bit over time. So all countries, we found that the rent space and political settlements played a causal role in explaining both the acceleration of growth after a period of stagnation collapse, or able to explain why countries were able to maintain growth after the initial positive growth episode. In all countries, we found that the key factor was not institutions, the key factor was not rules, the key factor was not policies or good policies. The key factor was politics. Rent space, the nature of firms in different parts of the rent space, and the political settlement. They was played the causal role explaining why countries saw growth happening and then why either the growth collapsed or why some countries maintained growth for a long time. On the other side, the flip side, the shift from unstable political settlement to which underpinned a disordered deals environment to stable political settlement led to an ordered deals environment. In other words, why did we see this move to disordered to ordered? Is because it saw a move from unstable political settlements to a stable political settlement. Examples are Cambodia in 1998, Ghana in 1983, Thailand in 1957. So again, very different periods of time. So this shift from unstable political settlement to a stable political settlement was very important, explaining why we saw a move from disordered to ordered deals, which, as I argued earlier, leads to investment and growth. And we also saw that firms in high-end sectors, mining, construction, utilities, were key players in the growth acceleration of episodes. And usually what we saw was that growth started, the growth was very much about close order deals that led to high income, rapid increasing incomes, but sooner or later, growth collapsed because close order deals by nature were problematic for maintaining growth. That's what we saw. The trajectory was that growth started because you had order deals coming in, but they were close order deals, and sooner or later, growth tended to collapse or stagnate. That's the trajectory we saw in our findings. And also, what we also found that in the countries with competitive political settlements, there again, it was very much that how settlements were, so we saw economic growth happening in competitive settlements, like as in Bangladesh, for example. But again, the question there was that did the deals move from closed to being more open? Did that happen? In other words, was it the case that deals were not only given to a few companies, but they were given to a lot more companies? And again, we found that in countries which had in close order deals, especially in dominant party settings, increasingly what we found was the problem was non-elites are challenging the political settlement because they could see in many cases, as I said in the Indian example, corruption with the close order deal. And I gave you India's example. Think of the Mubarak regime in Egypt. Very good example. Where it started, crony capitalism became so problematic, there was a big pushback, including the Arab Spring. So there are many examples of regimes which collapsed or growth collapsing because of this problem that non-elites do not like to see close order deals that lead to high corruption. Indonesia also is a good example because Indonesia saw very rapid growth for a long time under Suharto. And then what happened there was increasing corruption happening in the later years of Suharto regime, then leading to, the financial crisis also happened and growth collapsed in Indonesia for a long time. So there are many examples of this kind in our case studies. And so really in our case studies, we did not really observe successful examples of growth being maintained for extended period. That was interesting. We did not really see growth success. In other words, growth being positive for a long period of time. which tells us that there is something endemic about countries, developing countries, especially in Asia and Africa, which are, because of weak institutional context in terms of competitive clientelistic political settlements with the dominant or competitive, that tells us that regimes cannot survive for too long, or political settlements are unraveling after some time. Sometimes it takes a long time, like in Indonesia, it took a long time. In some other countries, it takes a much shorter time. But in the case studies we had, I should be clear, we did not have Korea and Taiwan in the case studies, which are probably very different stories. But in the case studies we had, we did not find successful examples of growth being maintained for extended period, which is a really interesting finding. Okay, so just to summarize the argument, in most developing countries, economic growth is episodic, and the business environment is defined by deals, not rules. That's a very important point. Even booms can generate the conditions for the next episode to be in stagnation, decline, if the political institutional development serves to bolster non-growth enhancing elite interests. So even if there's growth, rapid growth, but all the growth is doing is creating conditions for non-growth enhancing elite interests, for example, as I mentioned, crony capitalism, that kind of growth cannot survive. And sooner or later, we'll have decline. And decline tends to bring about more decline. Collapses and stagnation are the norm, not the exception. Right now, if you look around the developing world, many countries are in growth decline or growth stagnation. Of course, especially fragile and conflict-free states. So clearly, the stylus fact here is that we don't tend to see rapid, sustained growth, just the opposite. An argument here we're making is that it's because of the nature of the politics of the political settlement and the nature of the rent space. So that's a summary in 3 bullet points. Policy implications, let me just spend a few minutes there and I'll stop. So the point here is that this is why our argument is so much goes against the World Bank's argument doing business and so on, and other economic, policy advice here. What we're saying is that we need to understand that it's all about politics. It's not so much about economics. And if you look at business investment, for example, business investment follows the rents. They're not interested, the investment firms are not interested when it's not in their interest to try and ask for higher state capabilities. So in many cases, countries are trying to, or rather business interests are trying to actually weaken state capacity, which is conflicting with political development, because political development means stronger state capacity over time. So that's a really contradiction here, that not all companies, but many companies in developing countries are really not interested in stronger state capacity and therefore higher or better political development. What about aid, international development assistance? We make the argument that aid has to think about the different parts of the rent space, has to think about what can we do for different parts, and therefore you need to understand that in some part of the rent space, you need more support, and others, you actually want to lessen the support to that particular set of firms. Let's be more precise. We argue that private aid has to be situated such that you try and promote magicians and workhorses, not rentiers nor power brokers. But that is not often the case. In many countries, aid or development assistance is not targeted. And therefore, anybody can access it, including rentiers and power brokers. So that's why we say that we have to think about the politics of this. And governance has to be embedded in private sector development and economic growth. You cannot ignore the politics of this when it comes to economic growth. And that's probably why policy reforms have mixed effects, because sometimes policy reforms don't work because what happens in those cases are they're going against elite interests. Elites are not interested in those reforms. So they're doing it just because they have to do it. There's some pressure of the IMF or the World Bank or whoever it is, but they're not really interested. And so that's why trying to improve institutions across the board is not very helpful. Let me just make a couple of more points here. So one thing that I think comes out from our argument is, and we've been trying to make this point several times now, economic growth is not about economics per se. It's about politics. And we need to think about how we can have broad-based growth, which is really trying to provide more political representation for workhorses and magicians. How can we make sure the magicians and workhorses are more politically important than rentiers and power brokers? And that's often problematic because the ones who have the money are the rentiers and the power brokers. They're the ones who are politically very important. So how can we shift that? And how can we allow for more political representation, especially for workhorses, who are very small, often small in firms in the informal sector, and musicians? Final point from fragile states, which is not very relevant in Bangladesh, that we also make the point that this push towards democracy has often been the case with donors in countries like Afghanistan and Somalia is not a very good thing. Because pushing democracy in when countries are not ready for it leads to a situation where we have disordered deals. And that's not very helpful. We might need a period of close order deals, which might necessarily mean not democracy, but some kind of autocracy, at least in the beginning of the process of investment and growth. So that's very important, that democracy is important. Everybody wants democracy, of course, it's a citizen on democracy, but perhaps there's an argument not to push too much on that front till we are sure there is enough of a precondition for economic growth. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. That was fascinating.
Thank you, Fatima. Motamoti, I think I've gone a little bit over time, but not too bad, not too much, hopefully.
That was really interesting. I'm sure everybody was enjoying. So, like, আমাদের আসলে public policy space তো খুব established একটা narrative হচ্ছে stronger institution leads to sustained economic growth. So, এটা খুবই fresh একটা perspective ছিল and really interesting argument. So, তার সাথে সাথে স্যার অনেক draw করেছেন প্রফেসর মুশতাক খানের political settlement theory থেকে. And you'd be happy to know, স্যার আসলে আমাদের একটা ক্লাস নিয়েছেন political settlement এর উপর. So I'm sure অনেক অডিয়েন্স হয়তো রিলেট করতে পারছেন। আর তার সাথে সাথে আমাদের আজকে সেশনে জয়েন করেছেন আমাদের অনেকজন ফেলোজ এবং সিভিল সার্ভেন্ট। সো আমি স্পেশালি রিকোয়েস্ট করব তারেক স্যার, যিনি এক্স ফাইন্যান্স সেক্রেটারি বাংলাদেশে, স্যার যদি কিছু অ্যাড করতে চান বা স্যারের যদি কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন থাকে, প্রথমে স্যারের কাছে যেতে চাই।
I just, do you need to listen, Professor Kunal Sen? I was not thinking to, raise any issues or questions, but fundamentally, I belong to an opposite camp. To me, I think growth is a long-term phenomenon rather than short-term phenomenon. I do believe that growth is a issue not only political and economic, there is a great role of society in it. Social force, social dynamics play a very vital role, and that is the economic history of the world, economic history of development. Basically, Professor Kunal Sen's presentation based on certain assumptions, and I have some, disagreement with those assumptions. That's all. But I enjoyed your presentations and your hypotheses, and I think it's a new thought of a new way of thinking about growth. But I think in country like ours, we have to think something beyond political settlement. Society, even I think institution is important. Even I think rule is important. So that is from where I am. Thank you, Professor Kunal Sen, for your fascinating presentations.
Can I quickly respond, Fatima? So, and thank you so much for the comments. Actually, I don't think we disagree too much, to be honest. So, long-term growth, the shobai jane, it's very important. But long-term is ultimately, as John Maynard Keynes bolechilo, that in the long run, we're all dead. We have to think about long-term being a sequence of short terms, right? So, ki hobe 40 bochor pore, we don't know. And that's exactly what Keynes was saying. It's, we don't know what will happen in the long term. But to get to that long term, which is what we saw in Korea, they were not thinking about 40 years. They were not thinking of 50 years. They were thinking brick by brick, 5 বছর, 10 বছর, 20 বছর করে growth বাড়াচ্ছে। আর সেখানে হচ্ছে important point, because what you want to do is avoid growth stagnation, growth collapses. যেটা আমাদের point হচ্ছে যে rapid growth তো of course আমরা সবাই চাই, কিন্তু rapid growth 40 বছর হার্ডলি কোনো দেশে দেখা গেছে, except Korea, except Taiwan. প্রশ্নটা হচ্ছে যে কেমন করে তাহলে we can avoid stagnation যখন আসে। আর সেটা এখানে আর্গুমেন্টে হচ্ছে যে ওই সময় ক্ষেত্রে অনেক সময় deals, or in our case maybe we can argue weak institutions, are very important. Rules are, no one has any problem that we should have good rules. I mean, that's a given. No? I mean, we have to have good rules. And to get to those good rules, how do we get to those good rules? How do we get to the point where rules are being enforced fairly and so on? So our point is that we are not against the idea that we should not have rules-based economies or we shouldn't have long-term growth. Our point is that that's the ideal world, but the reality is very different. And we need to work with the reality and then think within the reality, what can one do? What can policymakers do? That's the point. Not that we have a fundamental problem with long-term growth or rules. No, absolutely not. I'm somebody who really believes that we need to have rules. And, let's be very honest. I mean, in the developing world, rules are not the hardly any countries follow rules. It's even true in the Western world. Even in the Western world, in the US, often we see deals too. So it's not only that rules deals are not there in developed countries. We do see that too. We see corruption there too. But it is true to say that in developing countries, we see more of deals than rules. That's a serious fact. No matter which country we might be thinking about. আমি আগে করেছি এই বইতে যে মালয়েশিয়ান থাইল্যান্ডেও এরকম দেখা গেছে ডিলস অনেকভাবে, আর সেটা অনেক এখন I can't explain that in detail here, but ওখানে যেটা those countries are considered to be middle success stories, ওখানেও এরকম প্রবলেম দেখা গেছে, which is why I argued that they have not reached high income status for a long time. So point here is that, just to summarize, of course long-term growth is important, of course rules are important, but reality is something different, and we need to work with the reality. It only target with second best options. We need to work with second best options. First best option, of course, rules, no doubt about it. But যখন যেটা দেখা যাচ্ছে না, when you cannot really have that in the immediate short term or medium term, let's think about second best options. And in that, as I argued, you need to think about the politics of it. Not in a bad sense. Politics is not a bad word to use, but to think about what explains the political interest that might come in from companies, and of course also from the policy world. So hopefully I made myself clear on this point, because it's very important for me to make clear that we are not against rules at all, not at all. I mean, that's what exactly we would like to see, or rules-based economies.
Thanks so much both. I think a conversation is through আরো পরিষ্কার হচ্ছে আমাদের কাছে আর্গুমেন্ট। সো এবং নেক্সট আমি আসলে আবু ইউসুফ স্যারের কাছে যেতে চাচ্ছিলাম। স্যার হচ্ছে জয়েন্ট সেক্রেটারি আমাদের ফাইন্যান্স ডিভিশনের। সো স্যার অলরেডি একটা কমেন্ট করেছেন, আমি স্যারকে রিকোয়েস্ট করতে চাচ্ছিলাম স্যার যদি অফ মিউট হয়ে কমেন্টটা বলতেন, আই থিংক ওটা বেটার হতো।
Thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate our today's keynote presenter, and the presentation has been very, very meticulous. Although I joined a bit late, I enjoyed the presentation thoroughly. This is I think a great work, because the presentation challenges our long-held view about the importance of institutions. And personally, I am a great believer in institutions and rule of law. But if, as the presentation mentions, if we give importance on political settlement and deals instead of rules and institutions, my understanding is that it may open the door for corruption, because not everyone will be able to enter into deals with the power brokers. Those who are most powerful politically, economically, those who can bribe others and who can make happy others, the decision makers or the bureaucrats who are in charge of making decision, they will be selectively make decisions, because the definition of deals means that they will be selective in enforcing the rules and other things. So my understanding is that we may enter into a chaotic society where there will be not much importance on rule of law and not of institutions. And if we see the definition of institutions, it's very, very important. It's not only physical institutions. Institutions also include the rules, regulations, quality of bureaucracy and everything. So institution also include rule of law. So I think this is a big, I would say big challenge on our long-held view. And my understanding is that we cannot afford to lose institutions. And we are very worried that in countries like ours, we are somehow getting institutions weaker, and this is a big concern. And in one point in time, the presenter also mentions very briefly about the less importance of democracy. So I don't know whether the lack of democracy in many countries across the world has prompted the researchers to go for the second best option. But my understanding is that I will always try to have the best, pursue the best option. Thank you.
Should I respond? Get very good comments. Or do you want to take some more comments?
No, thank you.
Oh, sir, feel free to comment now.
Should I respond?
You can respond now, sir. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So again, absolutely. I mean, I cannot agree more with what you said, sir, because it's really important to keep in mind that when we have deals, which is what the reality is, as I was saying, in many different countries, oftentimes, not always, oftentimes we lead to corruption, because deals are personalized interaction between the private sector and the political elite. So that's the point. I mean, and that's the whole thing. That how can we try and avoid that? Now, one thing important here is that we've said that it's more likely that if you have magicians and workhorses as being politically important, you're less likely to see corrupt deals. Because those magicians by nature, exporting firms, they are by nature, they are not interested in closed order deals or corrupt deals because they want to compete. Competition is not corruption. You have to be productive. You cannot compete in the world market these days. We're not productive. So I use a ready-made garments example in Bangladesh. Of course, I'm a little bit careful there because we have a case study on Bangladesh in our book done by Mirza Hassan and Salim Raihan, who many of you might know. Mirza is, I think, in BIGD, and Salim, of course, many of you know, is in the University of Dhaka. They argue actually that the ready-made garment sector was not open ordered. They argue, and I'm just quoting them, so please don't misunderstand me. They argue that basically what was happening was the Ready-Made Garments Association was entering in the closed order deal with the political elites. So that's interesting because I would have thought that in Bangladesh, the ready-made garment sector is a good example of open deals, but that's not what we learned from this particular case study. I would encourage the audience here to read this case study by two very, very eminent scholars in Bangladesh. And it's really fascinating how well they brought in economics and politics of understanding Bangladesh. They look at the history of Bangladesh over 30, 40 years, pretty much since the 1980s, and they explain what has happened over time in explaining economic growth, bringing in our framework, we use our framework. So again, coming back to what I said, that yes, of course, we need to avoid corruption. That's absolutely essential. That's no doubt about it. So having this, one has to be a little bit careful here because in Korea, in the first periods of growth, there was quite a bit of corruption. There's quite a bit of corruption. Chaeballs, who we know, the famous companies that are there in Korea, Honda and Kia and so on, they were corrupt. They were giving money to the autocratic rulers at that time to keep them happy. But that didn't stop growth because the rulers were like, okay, you're giving us some bribes, but you need to perform. If you cannot perform in the world market, you're not going to get any more of the deals. The deals were growth enhancing. In other words, there was a lot of pressure on these chaeballs to compete in international markets. But Korea is a bit unusual, actually. This is not the case in most other countries. Often corruption doesn't end in a nice way. So Korea is interesting in that sense. And the other point about democracy is that, of course, again, who cannot ever, we all want democracy. We want genuine democracy. But what I think we are trying to say is that if a country is not ready yet for democracy, and that takes preparation, Afghanistan is a very good example where institutions were not ready yet for, and when I say democracy, I mean elections, for example. Then you need to be careful because what you want is economic growth to start. That leads to more prosperity. And then there's a demand for better services of the government and so on. Citizens get involved and democracy comes into the net from the society itself. And one more point that I think earlier was made, we do think that non-state actors, civil society is very important. We do make that point about our framework. And I made the example of the Indian case. where non-state actors, civil society, media were very important in explaining what happened in India in the 2000s, the early 2000s. So in our framework, they also play a part, but maybe not in the way perhaps we tend to see civil society. After all, we talk about economic growth. And so their role is a different role than, say, when they want, let's say, more education or better public services. But we don't see them not as being unimportant. They are important. So again, just to sort of summarize, corruption, of course, is a bad thing. And we would like to see a different kind of growth than a growth based on close order deals which are corrupt. And as I said, in countries where magicians are favored, that's more likely that deals will not be corrupt. We'll have open order deals, and economic growth will take place and maybe carry on for some time. And the best examples of that, I think, of course, are Korea and Taiwan early on. More recently, maybe Southeast Asian countries might be, but again, that's not so obvious. But it's a fact that we want to see in our framework, we're making an argument that magicians and workhorses are very important in driving the good kind of growth, the kind of growth we want, which is good, economic growth, which is not based on corruption. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. আমি তারিক স্যারকে আনমিউট করতে দেখেছিলাম। স্যার, আপনি কি কিছু অ্যাড করতে চাচ্ছিলেন?
Actually, আমি জাস্ট আমার চেহারাটা দেখাইনি, চেহারাটা একটু দেখাই। আর আমার লাস্ট পয়েন্ট, last point to Professor Kunal. Actually, theoretically, it is a very interesting model, but in your overall growth space, basically, there are only two dominant players, the politicians and the magician, or whatever you term it, a business group. Now, even from the experience of Bangladesh, and you referred to the garments industries, economics and real economic growth is the growth of the people. And in your model, you haven't talked about people at all. The large, the masses, the citizens of the country. And when we are developing a model just with two players, politicians and businessmen, obviously the policy making of that country should be controlled not by the will of the people, but the will of those few big deal makers. And that will basically my apprehensions that, I haven't gone through your model in details, but up to this point, I think if you can bring in the will of people somehow into the model, that will make your model more acceptable and more universal. Thank you, Professor Kunal.
Thank you. Very nice one.
My personal thanks to you. And thanks to YPF. I am a very fan of this Bangladeshi young group. They are doing a lot of things, and I want to thank them again for, giving me the opportunity to talking to you and knowing you, I'm seeing you for the first time. So that's, I think, I'm really happy. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope to meet you in person. আশা করি আমি যখন ঢাকাতে আসবো আপনার সাথে তখন
আসলে অবশ্যই যোগাযোগ করবেন।
Absolutely, নিশ্চয়ই করব।
YPF এর ওরা সবাই চেনে, আবির চেনে ভালো করে। কাজে
I look forward to it.
Okay, thank you.
থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ। আমাদের ফেসবুকেও অনেক কোয়েশ্চেন্স এসেছে যেগুলোতে আমরা যাব। তার আগে আমি কুইকলি একটু অ্যাড্রেস করতে চাই। আমাদের সাথে সিরাজুন স্যার, সামা আপা, সোমা আপা আপনারা আছেন। থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ ফর জয়নিং আস টুডে। আপনারা যদি কিছু অ্যাড করতে চান, আমি কুইকলি যেতে চাই আপনাদের কাছে বিফোর গোয়িং টু দ্য ফেসবুক কোয়েশ্চেন্স। ইউসুফ স্যার হাত উঠিয়েছেন, I can see your hands raised. স্যার আসতে you can come off mute and add your comment.
I have got a very quick, not a question, but a very quick, I would love to have a very quick clarification from Professor Kunal Sen. You have given the example of Korea with regard to the corruption and other things in getting prosperity at the initial stage of development of the country. And you have also mentioned that Korea is one of the exceptions. I'm curious to know, by Korean example, have you basically referred to the concept of primitive accumulation? Thank you, sir.
That's a very good question. I think I should we collect more questions, or how do you want to do it?
Sure, maybe আমি just আর কিছু questions একবারে বলে দিতে চাই, then maybe you can respond একসাথে.
Sure, নিশ্চয়ই.
So আমাদের লাইভ থেকে কিছু কোয়েশ্চেন এসেছে। নুসান্তা জিজ্ঞেস করেছে, what can be a proper model for our country's economic growth? এবং আরেকটা কোয়েশ্চেন হচ্ছে, what should be the initial focus while forming long-term policies for Bangladesh? So maybe এই দুটো কোয়েশ্চেন এখন নেওয়া যেতে পারে। Over to you, sir.
So প্রথম যেটা, very nice question, primitive accumulation. কোরিয়া কি primitive accumulation হয়েছিল, that's difficult to say. And I mean, আমার মনে হয় যে কোরিয়াতে একটা তো ইম্পর্টেন্ট ফ্যাক্টর ছিল যে ওখানে যারা প্রথম দিকে they were in power, which is a mostly autocratic military rule, they had this kind of vision of Korea becoming richer over time. This is what is called a developmental state. ওটা একটা ছিল ওদের vision একটা। এই জন্য কোরিয়াতে অনেক যে ভুল অনেক সময় অন্য দেশে, corruption, this and that, সেগুলো প্রথম দিকে হয়নি, হয়েছিল পরের দিকে। তারপরে মিলিটারি রুলটা obviously had a problem with the country, the citizens went against military rule, but প্রথম দিকে হয়নি। আর আরেকটা যেটা করেছিল, যেটা বলছিলাম, যে what they could do is that the companies গুলোকে ওরা ডিসিপ্লিন করতে পেরেছিল। চাইবলস গুলো, যেগুলো বড় বড় চাইবলস যেটা এক্সপোর্ট করছে in international markets, they were kept on a very tight leash, যে you got to export or we'll stop all the subsidies and all the deals. সেটা কিন্তু করা খুব ডিফিকাল্ট। এটা অনেক দেশ করতে পারেনি, ইন্ডিয়া এগেন করতে পারেনি। ইন্ডিয়াতে ইনফাইন্যান্স ইন্ডাস্ট্রি প্রোটেকশনে করতে চেষ্টা করেছিল উইথ সাম কোম্পানিজ, করতে পারলো না। they could not discipline those companies. সেই জন্য ইন্ডিয়াতে অফকোর্স we know that there was a period of long economic stagnation. এটা করা খুব ডিফিকাল্ট, এটা ডিসিপ্লিনিংটা করা খুব ডিফিকাল্ট আসলে, disciplining companies, especially big companies. On the question about that like for Bangladesh, again, I should be careful because, as I said, there's a very good chapter in a book by two excellent Bangladeshi scholars. But the point, I think, is that first, is a bigger question is, are we seeing a shift in Bangladesh from a cooperative settlement to a dominant settlement? There might be a question that might be happening. What does that mean for the future, for political development and economic development? Now, there are the pros and cons to this. The pro is that a dominant settlement or a long-term horizon থাকে, and deals can be ordered when they offer to economic actors. But the other side would be that when you have a dominant settlement, it might also lead to crony capitalism, as we saw in Suharto's time and many other countries, many other regimes. So it's a tricky question to answer, and I think it's not clear to me which way we might see it is progressing. If we agree there's a dominant settlement slowly emerging, which again, it's not so obvious. So that's one question. আরেকটা প্রশ্ন হচ্ছে যে, আমার মনে হয় for Bangladesh, which is now kind of moving towards middle income status, যেটা আমি আর্গিউ করেছি মালয়েশিয়া and Thailand, যেটা প্রবলেম হয়েছিল ওই দুটো দেশে, because they had also long periods of growth. Malaysia and Thailand from around the 1970s to the 1990s, before the financial crisis, বেশ কয়েক বছর ধরে গ্রোথ হচ্ছিল। কিন্তু ওই দুটো দেশে একটা যেটা হয়নি আর এখনো অতভাবে হয়নি, which they did not improve the institutions. And there was I argue there was a reason for that, because the political elites were not really interested in that. They were trying to keep still this sort of political settlement. They were giving deals to different companies and different interests. Bumiputra companies in Malaysia, for example, and so on. In Thailand, it was being given to companies which were close to the monarchy and the army. So one lesson for Bangladesh is, and this is where I agree with what was said about institutions, you need to move towards good institutions over time. There has to be this incremental move. It cannot happen একসঙ্গে হবে না, আস্তে আস্তে হবে, কিন্তু that has to happen over time. আর সেখানে হচ্ছে question যে ওই interest, is there interest among political elites to move the country towards better institutions, not best quality institutions, but better institutions. সেটাই হচ্ছে অনেক সময় একটা প্রবলেম, যেটা আমি আর্গিউ করেছি অন্য জায়গায়। মিডল ইনকাম ট্র্যাপ is a trap because of the not able to move towards better institutions. আর সেটা অনেক সময় politics plays a role, কেন সেটা হয় না। So Bangladesh, I think it's a really important question. Are we seeing, and on this perhaps the audience knows better than I do, are we seeing a movement towards better quality institutions? Maybe not rules yet, that's difficult to see, but maybe at least somewhat moving away from personalized deals, totally personalized deals. Along with the fact that so that's our question, number one. And number two is that how is the political settlement evolving to support this move towards better quality institutions? Is it supporting the process or is it coming in the way? So just want to say, I mean, as I said, this is a complex issue, and I'm not the best person to speak about Bangladesh, but this is an important question for Bangladesh to also think about, Bangladeshi scholars think about, and policymakers.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. আমি আরেকটা কোয়েশ্চেনে যাব লাইভ থেকে, বাট মিনওয়াইল যারা জুমে জয়েন করেছেন, আপনারা যদি হ্যান্ড রেজ করতে চান আমরা ডিরেক্টলি কোয়েশ্চেন নিতে পারি। সো ফেসবুক লাইভে ইনাম আহমেদ শুভ কোয়েশ্চেন করেছেন, when a company or industry is sanctioned because of global politics and that affects the overall trade economy, how will it be how will it be dealt within the current situation? For example, Maersk or Russian vessels. I can also post it in the chat. I can also post it in the chat.
Meanwhile, if I may ask a question.
Yeah, sure. Because
I think this is fascinating because this work and then subsequent work by Stefan Darkon on gambling on development, I think it sort of questions a lot of the narratives by Asimoglu and Robinson. So it's quite fascinating as a researcher of political economy. So my question is, you mentioned about dualistic deal environment in Malaysia and Thailand, and you also mentioned that there is a sell-out date. So আপনি একটু বলেছেন, বাট আপনি যদি আরেকটু এক্সপ্যান্ড করতেন। আর সাবসিকুয়েন্ট একটা কোয়েশ্চেন হচ্ছে যে আমরা যদি জিডিপি পার ক্যাপিটা বা পার ক্যাপিটা ইনকামকে ইন্ডিকেটর হিসেবে নেই গ্রোথের, তাইলে তো ডেফিনেটলি হোয়াট এভার ইউ সেড মেক্স আ লট অফ সেন্স। আমরা যদি স্যার ইকোনমিক আপগ্রেডিং, ইন্ডাস্ট্রিয়াল আপগ্রেডিং কে নেই, তাইলে কি উড দিস স্টিল হোল্ড ট্রু? For example, if we think about moving to a more sophisticated sectors, ওই জায়গায় যদি আমরা চিন্তা করি, তখনও কি I think মানে lot of the things that you say, materials that you used would be relevant or not? Just a question.
Okay, I'm trying to still understand this question on the chat. I'm not sure how much I can say on this question on the companies by cycle everything, but going back to Abir's question, actually, it's a very good question. As you know, the development that Stefan Darkon boy could be important boy on developmental bargains. Is somewhat, in fact, as you might have seen, draws a lot, also has overlaps with our argument also quite a bit. In fact, Stefan does also cite our work quite a bit. Dualistic deals, so many of the countries which succeeded in growth for some time had dualistic deals environment. They would offer close order deals to companies in the power broker rentier space to extract rents. Maybe corruption, maybe not, but extracting rents. But they would also offer open order deals to magicians to bring also for economic growth to happen. Now, you can do that for quite some time, right? Aggregate, you're offering close order deals to the telecommunication company in your country or the construction company in your country because you want the rents. And you want to have a rent sharing arrangement. On the other hand, you're offering deals, open order deals to the garments firms or to the leather firms or the footwear firms. So সেটা অনেকটা কিন্তু কাজ করে, দেখা গেছে এগুলো কাজ করেছে as in Malaysia and Thailand. ওটা একটা প্রবলেম হচ্ছে যে at some point ওটা করে ইনস্টিটিউশনগুলো ইমপ্রুভ করছে না, কেননা একদিকে চলছে এরকম কলিউশন, আরেকদিকে চলছে institution হয়তো improve করছে on the magician side. And sooner or later that backfires. That's the argument. Sooner or later that backfires because what you really want is a move away from close order deals everywhere, not just in the Malaysian sector. Sheta Malaysian Thailand hoini. Oijono, they went to the situation where they never could go into the high income status for a very long time. Now, so dualism একটা অনেক গুণ আছে because একদিকে growth হচ্ছে আর একদিকে তুমি corruption, rent extraction, rent sharing হচ্ছে, political settlement একদিকে stable থাকছে because you're collecting the rents from one group of companies while you're trying to make other group of companies export oriented and very competitive. Kintu it cannot really, there's a sell by date as you also put it. You cannot do it forever. Now in Bangladesh, are we seeing a dualistic deals environment? That's an interesting observation question. Maybe yes, to some extent, I suppose. You're seeing a dualistic deals environment like in the finance sector, microfinance, অনেক competition, অনেক open deals. অন্যদিকে অনেক collision চলছে, especially with construction and so on and so forth. So there is an open question. I have to say cannot say on anything more concretely on this because I've not studied this myself. I've not done field work on this. তো সেই জন্য আমি বেশি থেকে আর কিছু বলতে চাই না, কিন্তু এটা হতে পারে। কিন্তু আমার পয়েন্টটা হচ্ছে যে ওরকম ডিলস, ডুয়ালিস্টিক ডিলস আর একটা বড় অসুবিধা আছে। আর ওই জন্য countries have to start thinking, political leaders have to think যে কদিন ধরে চালাতে পারবো। আর যেটা মালয়েশিয়া থাইল্যান্ডে দেখা গেল যে চেষ্টা করে চালাতে কিন্তু এটা ব্যাকফায়ার করলো, চেষ্টা করে ডুয়ালিস্টিক ডিলস এনভায়রনমেন্ট চালাতে অনেকদিন ধরে কিন্তু ব্যাকফায়ার করলো। So সেটাও একটা important point. It's a very good question that you asked. And what is the second question you asked? Sorry, I didn't make my notes on this.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Second question is just briefly, যে আমরা যদি economic industrial upgrading কে ধরি, তাহলে কি many of the arguments that you mentioned in the book, I think it makes perfect sense if we take per capita income as an indicator, growth as an income. But আমরা যদি industrial upgrading কে ধরি, তাইলেও কি would this be applicable? A Korean example, I think it would be, but I just wanted to hear your insights on that.
Well, this is again এখানে তো মুস্তাকের নিজের কাজ আছে না, মুস্তাক খানের নিজের কাজ আছে that and this is the point about the disciplining mechanisms, right? That if you are trying to discipline companies to make them more productive to face in extra world competition, then the deals that you're offering has to have performance features in it. In other words, if I offer a deal to a garments company and say, okay, you're going to get your license very quickly, or you're going to get some credit subsidy, I have to say to them, look, I'll do that for you, but you need to do this for us. You need to be productive. You need to be dynamic. You need to bring in technological innovation. That is what one can call industrial policy. That is a different kind of argument than what has been often talked about industrial policy. So it's selective. You're backing a few companies, but you're making sure that deal you're offering has a performance feature to it. In other words, it's not a deal where you say, okay, I'll give you the subsidy, you do what you want. I'm not going to bother you again. No. And that's what I meant about Korea. And in the Bangladesh case, it's important, and this is the argument, I'm just using Mustaq's work in this here. Argument is that has not happened really. We haven't seen deals being used to make companies more productive. I mean, one example, I've often been somewhat puzzled that in Bangladesh, we haven't seen electronics companies doing really flourishing. I mean, we haven't seen a large electronics sector. While in Malaysia and Thailand and some of the other Southeast Asian countries, there was a move away from garments towards electronics. And electronics is a more technologically complex industry than garments, as we know. Now, this is where maybe there's a problem that the deals are not performance-based deals in Bangladesh, perhaps. And that's why we are not seeing the evolution of industry. So Bangladesh should really be diversifying away from ready-made garments. It's not really good to put all your eggs in one basket, as the saying goes, to only expect the ready-made garment sector will, deliver for you, especially when we have increasingly entry of low-cost garment producers going on over time. So that's an interesting point, that maybe the lack of diversification in Bangladesh is linked to the lack of industrial policy, in the sense of not making sure that some of these companies which are garments can slowly move into more technologically complex activities, right? And that's a really important point about industrial policy in Bangladesh, which I think is what I agree with Mustaq Khan on this, that has not happened, while we see that happened in Korea. And more recently, I'm not sure, I don't know whether I would argue that we see that, to some extent also we see that in Thailand, I would say yes, I would say automotive ancillaries হয়েছে, মালয়েশিয়াতে কিছু ইলেকট্রনিক্সে হয়েছে, কিন্তু ওটা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট যে ডিল যদি থাকে, if you're offering a deal, there needs to be a performance-based criteria to it. Otherwise, industrial policy হবে না, updating হবে না.
Thank you so much, sir. I'll be very happy to know that YPF we have an advocacy project called Coalition for Upgrading Bangladesh Economy. So we are focusing on this advocacy. We need to move beyond garments. And even within garments, we have to go to high-value products. But the garments are by electronics, automotives, digital economy. This upgrade korte hole ei push ta je dorkar. Oita niye you're working, and we'd really like to have you as one of our advisors in that to guide us in this very important work. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I think I can't resist, and I have a question. I think Abhipay's সাথে আমি just একটু follow up একটা question add করব, কারণ কিউব থেকে আমরা actually focus করছি not just economic upgrading, also for social upgrading, because although RMG sector আমরা huge economic growth দেখেছি, but there were cases of human rights violation, and also moving forwards, we want to make sure যে development যাতে আরো বেশি inclusive হয়. So in that case, আরো inclusive, proper বা better deals এর জন্য, do you have any policy recommendations on that regard?
I think এটা একটা difficult question. আমার যেটা মনে হয় যে, the way this happens, having more open deals, is to have stronger collective action by magicians. In other words, magicians যারা সব আছে, যেমন আমি বললো ইলেকট্রনিক্স, যদি যাই ইলেকট্রনিক্স ফার্ম বেশি নেই বাংলাদেশি যারা আছে, getting together and asking for better deals. That collective action is very important. Often আমরা যখন state business relations নিয়ে কথা বলি, we talk about two kinds of state business relations. একটা হচ্ছে collusive, যেখানে there's crony capitalism, this and that, corruption, যাই হোক. আর একটা হচ্ছে synergistic. The state is encouraging business, but also providing them with certain kinds of environment, including maybe specific kinds of deals. And that's what I think, what you're trying to say in this framework, যে ওই রকম open deals থাকলে, আর ওখানে business interests are very important, যারা চায়. Not all business want closed deals. No, not at all. অনেক business interests চায় open deals. ওরা চায় না যে it should be only given to this company or that company. না, ওরা চায় না সেটা. সেরকম collective interest among business interests, maybe small industry, maybe a medium industry, maybe even much more micro enterprises. How do they get together to ask for open deals? And that's where I feel that should be the focus of the donor community. They should try to provide a way that this kind of interests get together. Because if you look at a typical business association, কি দেখা যায়? A typical business association দেখা যায় বড় বড় কোম্পানিগুলো ডমিনেট করছে। ওদের ওই কোম্পানি থেকে প্রেসিডেন্টস আসে, ওই কোম্পানি থেকে সবকিছু, ওদের ইন্টারেস্টটা রিফ্লেক্টস ইন দিস অ্যাসোসিয়েশন। সেটা উচিত না। সেখানেই হচ্ছে ব্যাপার যে how do we make sure that the business associations, whichever chambers of commerce, whatever we see in any country, needs to be inclusive of those other players, economic actors, especially the ones who are coming from the magician and workers segments of the rent space. And that's the problem, that we don't seem to see that often in many countries, including perhaps even in Bangladesh, I would argue. And so that's the way. How to do that? More tricky, difficult, কিন্তু এটা খুব দরকার করা।
Thank you so much, sir. This was truly fascinating, and I'm sure আরো অনেক questions আসছে এখনো, এবং we would love to have this conversation for longer time, but সময় স্বল্পতার জন্য আমাদের হয়তো এখন ক্লোজ করতে হচ্ছে। সো আমি এনকারেজ করব যারা এখনো কমেন্টস আছে বা কোয়েশ্চেন্স আছে, ইউ ক্যান রিচ আউট টু আস, ইমেল করলে আমরা হয়তো স্যারের কাছে ফরওয়ার্ড করে দিতে পারি ইমেলটা। অ্যান্ড থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ ফর ইউর পার্টিসিপেশন টুডে। এবং আমাদের সিভিল সার্ভেন্টস যারা জয়েন করেছেন, ফেলোসরা যারা জয়েন করেছেন, আপনাদেরকে অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ। আর কুনাল স্যার, আপনার এত ব্যস্ত সময়ের মধ্যে থেকে আমাদের জন্য সময় দেওয়ার জন্য অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ। ইট ওয়াজ আ ট্রুলি ফ্যাসিনেটিং সেশন। সো
Thank you very much. Actually, really enjoyed it. খুব ভালো লাগলো। খুব ভালো প্রশ্ন পেয়েছি and very nice
আপনার কাছ থেকে
discussion.
লাস্ট একটা কমেন্ট নিয়ে শেষ করে দিতে চাই।
Thank you so much. আশা করি আমি যখন ঢাকাতে আসবো সবার সাথে আলাপ করতে পারবো। But কিন্তু খুব এনজয় করলাম। Thank you.
Thank you so much. এবং আপনারা যেরকম বললেন যে আমরা আপনাকে অ্যাডভাইজার হিসেবে পেতে চাই, so looking forward to that. Thank you so much, sir.
Absolutely. ঠিক আছে।